How's it going, everyone? Today I want to talk to you guys about how to choose a diameter for your microliter system. So microliters came on the scene, started becoming popular about 6 years ago or so, and today they're probably the most popular way people are Euro nymphing around the world. Maybe not quite yet in America, but definitely in other countries. You hear microliter a lot, but what that means specifically and what size of microliter should you be fishing is still kind of a blurry area. So before we really get kicked off, I just want to talk briefly about what I mean when I say microliter system. It is basically one flat level section of mono from fly line all the way down to tippet. There's no need for a taper in there, just based on the mechanics of the way this is cast. The leader is not doing a lot of work. You're leaving a lot of that up to the fly, as well as, it's already relatively thin. You don't want to add any extra points of failure into there with those knots. So personally, the system that I like is this Pierre Sempe green leader material. I find it very visible. It's very strong. It knots pretty well. I've not personally had a problem with it breaking in situations I didn't think it should have broken. And it's probably the most popular material for this method out there right now, just generally. Every material is going to work a little bit differently, but the Sempe material is measured in millimeters. So the smallest size is going to be 0.12 millimeters. Then it's going to be 0.14 millimeters, up to 0.16, 0.18, and then they have 0.2 and 0.22 as well. Now you can try and convert these sizes to inches or into the X system if you want. I find that in general they run a little bit bigger than advertised, and the breaking strength, because of all the colorant in them, is going to be a little bit weaker than material of a similar diameter. So it's best to kind of get an anecdotal idea of how strong this is and how it compares to some of the other stuff you fish. Alright, so let's get into what you got to think about when you're actually choosing a leader diameter. So I have a little bit of a decision tree that I go through. Starts with environmental factors. There's two environmental factors that you got to think about. The first is going to be tippet size, and so what strength of tippet you're fishing, and then the next is going to be wind speed. So how much do you have to fight a breeze with your leader while you're making those drifts. Kind of next step down is going to be casting. So do you need the assistance of a little bit of a thicker leader to kind of help you cast lighter flies? And that can definitely be a determining factor, especially when people are getting into the microliter stuff or getting into Euro nymphing in general, and your cast maybe isn't quite as refined. And then next down from there is going to be the tactics that you're going to fish for the day. So how is kind of the methods of fishing you're planning on using going to affect what leader you choose. So the first environmental factor is going to be tippet size. So you always want your tippet to be weaker than the main leader you're fishing. If it's not, then you risk a break in the middle of your leader and you're going to have to retie a lot, going to waste a lot of material. So you always want that tippet to be just a little bit weaker than the main line. That's going to dictate what size leader you fish, even though the perfect leader size for the tactics you're fishing may be a little bit smaller than you want. So for example, I was in New Zealand for the last 5 weeks. When I was over there, we were fishing probably 5.5x tippet at the lightest, which meant the lightest leader that I could fish was 0.16 instead of 0.12, which I probably would have preferred to fish based on the tactics we were using. So even though a lighter leader would have made me perform better fishing, it would have really hindered my ability to land fish, and I probably would have broken my leader in the middle of it a couple times. The other environmental factor is wind speed. So unlike some of the traditional tapered leader systems with microleaders, you're very susceptible to the wind because they have a lot less mass. When you're looking at microleader diameters, there's two factors that you're changing with diameter, and that's surface area and mass. So as you go down in size, your surface area is going to decrease slower than your mass is. And kind of what that means for us in the real world is the lower you go, the more susceptible to wind your leader is, because it's going to have a bigger surface area to mass ratio. So when you go up to 18, the surface area doesn't increase a terrible amount, the mass increases a lot, and so it's a lot more steadfast in the wind. So if we're going to have high winds when I'm fishing, then I try and go for maybe a little bit of an upsize, If it's going to be really windy, then I'll go all the way up to this 0.18 here, and that gives me the ability to fight the wind, even though I may get a little bit more sag and my presentations may not be as perfect as they could be with 0.12. 0.12 doesn't really help me if it's getting blown around left and right all by the wind. Coming down a level from environmental factors, now we have casting factors, and I think this is where a lot of people tend to get hung up on some of the thicker leaders without going down and trying some of the thinner ones, is because casting is a little bit of a concern. And it is true, as you go down in size, it does become a little bit different of a cast. I'm not going to say trickier, but it is a little bit of a different situation. The thicker line you have, the more that is going to contribute to the cast and carrying your fly towards the target. The thinner you go, the less it's going to contribute, the more emphasis you put on the fly traveling to the target and pulling your leader behind it. So thicker lines are going to cast lighter flies a little easier, and thinner lines are going to make it a little bit more hard. With proper casting, with a lot of practice, you can end up casting both pretty much the same with the same effectiveness, but it's always going to be a little bit easier and take a little bit less thought and effort to cast those lighter flies on the thicker lines. Personally, I try and keep casting out of the equation for deciding what diameter I'm going to use, especially because under FIPS competition rules, I have a set leader length, and I can cast a fly that distance no matter what size I'm using in pretty much any condition. It's not an incredibly far distance. So that's why I take that out of my equation. If you do have some trouble with casting, you want a little bit more assistance, or you don't want to, have to put as much effort into it on the day, you can choose a heavier size. But if you're relying solely on the diameter of your leader to make that cast, then you are going to lose out on some of the more finesse tactics and lighter tactics you can do with a thinner diameter leader. I always recommend experimenting around and trying it if you can, because I find a lot of people can cast a thin leader way better than they expect they're going to be able to. We've gone through casting factors, environmental factors. Now we're going to get into techniques and how different diameters can help you do what technique you want to do for the day a little bit better. So when you're looking at diameter, you can think of it as a spectrum. On the heavier end of the spectrum, down by 0.18, is going to be the sighter floating tactics, the tactics that require a little bit of sag, all the things that come with a higher mass, higher surface area. On the lighter end of the spectrum is going to be your high connectivity tactics, when you want to be really tight to your flies and have as little sag as possible. So for me, the most important factors technique-wise are that heavier, thicker leaders are going to sighter float better. They're going to be a little bit more visible. The higher surface area is going to help them stay on top of the water a little bit better, versus the lighter diameter leaders, which are going to help you stay a lot tighter to the flies, have a lot less sag, and do those standard, above the water drifts a little bit better. And when I'm choosing what diameter I want for the day, I'm going to think about how much I'm going to be sighter floating compared to standard drifting. If I'm going to be doing primarily all sighter floating all day, say fishing really light bugs in relatively shallow water to pretty active fish, I'm going to probably choose 0.18 because that's going to be my primary sighter floating line. If the opposite is true, and I'm going to not be sighter floating at all or sighter floating very little, I'm going to choose 0.12. If I'm going to be doing it somewhere, 50-50, it's going to be closer to 0.14 because that's going to give me the best split between being able to sighter float and also having a low mass to hold it off the water. If it's going to be a little bit more sighter floating, I'll go 0.16. So it's just looking at what I think I'm going to do throughout the day and choosing the leader that's going to let me do the primary tactic best while still being able to do the secondary tactic. For example, I make a lot of casts that start with a sighter float. As they come in and get maybe 10-15 feet away from me, I start lifting into that and bring it into a standard drift, and I finish out that drift with a sighter above the water type presentation. And so I want a leader that's going to be able to do both of those things. One other thing to consider is that sometimes the fish don't want the laser tight presentation that comes with a thin diameter leader. Sometimes that can impart a little bit too much movement to the fly. They can feel the tension a little bit too fast. And having a belly from a little bit of sag can help your presentation and end up catching you more fish. So, well, those days are a little bit rare. I do see them happen a couple times a year, and I will take note of that and go up a little bit in my leader diameter so that I can get a little bit of that sag, a little bit of that belly. So that's one other thing that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about diameter, but it's a lower consideration than everything else we just talked about. Just to recap it, when I'm thinking about what diameter I'm going to fish for the day, I'm considering the environmental factors of tippet strength and wind speed. That's going to kind of predetermine what sizes I have the option to fish. Then I'm going down into casting, and that's going to take a little bit more decision away potentially. And then down into the tactics I'm going to fish for the day. So mainly whether I want to mainly sighter float or mainly tight line. And if I want to do some split between those, which I usually or pretty much always want to do some split between those, what diameter is going to accommodate my primary tactic best while still allowing me to do my secondary tactic. So for me, what usually accommodates all those factors is 0.14 millimeter. I'm fishing this anywhere between 55 and 65% of the time, if I had to guess. It has a great surface area to mass ratio that allows it to fight the wind really well, while still maintaining a relatively tight connection to the fly and still being able to sight or float fairly well with even relatively heavy flies. That's pretty much everything that I consider when choosing a diameter. So it's great to have a go-to diameter, but if you're not using other diameters of microliter, you are going to be missing out on some efficiency and some really good days on the water. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit from that, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.